space.
Yeah. Thank you for welcoming me.
Yeah.
I just popped in that second ago.
With complete continuity.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. We've been talking about the nature of how you start the conversation and what you do with the record button and that kind of feeling of moving between the two. But all I'm really going to say for introduction, for people who don't know you, is that you host the VoiceCraft Collective, and you've been doing that for about 3 years. And I kind of came across you about a year ago, and I saw that you were doing a lot in the space and talking to lots of very interesting people. And personally, for me, showing that it is kind of possible to come in without, already having the backing of some newspaper or something, and just start and reach out to people and do something your own that's quite unique.
Yeah, it's a journey of convincing people more or less that you're reasonable enough to have a conversation with. It doesn't always succeed. Yeah. Still doesn't always succeed, but it seems like there's a decent hit rate of people deciding, yeah, okay, let's have a chat.
Yeah, that's kind of special in itself. For me, one thing that I'm liking about it is that it's really at my own pace. Because it's like, I'm doing it, but I'm also working and I'm also on my own kind of self path. And so you go through periods where you're like doing personal work or something's coming up and you don't want to be hammering away on something. You want to be like reading or hiking or drawing or something. So you can take it as it comes. And like, yes. I'm not like stacking up like loads and loads of people with arranged conversations. I'm like kind of reaching out to, probably have 2 other people lined out in the future after this one. And it won't be more than that. That's nice.
Yeah. I think the key thing is to live your life and to learn, and follow the path of that. And then, well, fingers crossed, you have something somewhat interesting to say. Yeah. How have you seen the journey develop? Did you have a mind that you would be interested to talk about certain subjects, and has it changed? What do you see this as now? If you have a vision for the kinds of moments you're looking to create, or the kind of ideas you're looking to further, are you trying to communicate something? Are you trying to figure something out? Can you speak to if there's a goal in that kind of sense?
It's very congruent with what you said about live your life. It's trying to move it as much as possible into the space of more as an artistic kind of endeavor, and also it becoming more and more entangled with the progression and change of my own kind of internal spiritual, physiological change. So there was a desire starting out to step into the conversation, and a desire to create a kind of machine, or like a ship, like a container that was going to allow that to take place. But it's become a lot more relational. I've come to see that a lot more of my kind of emotional development is in relationship to it. and I've started to think of the sense space, which I'm very happy had a kind of ambiguity and openness in it when I started out with the name. Because initially I was going to call it Sense Project, but that was very much, I have a goal in mind, whereas this is more like a... So a large part of it is now when I find myself in solitude, which is a lot in the context of the last 3 months. I'm spending a lot of time listening to what's going on for me internally and trying to like sharpen that ear for it. And then I'm recently dropping into a lot more of the emerging communities, cropping up around Rebel Wisdom and the Stoa, and dropping into these group calls with complete strangers, which are themed around different things. Some of them are circling, some of them are collective presencing. But I'm finding a continuity in all of them. And they're feeling like the most salient thing for me right now. I'm just getting into these group contexts and really bringing that listening that I'm doing on my own to bear in the context of these groups, and just kind of listening and waiting for that like tuning in. And at the moment that happens, there's a kind of ecstatic release of energy.
Does that come out in expression?
Well, naming it tends to have an impact upon people. Just describing what's going on for me, like I'm kind of, I think I've seen you kind of tapping into the same thing of like actually moving your body as you're listening. You can kind of like leverage or like subtly shift that energy that's coming, and then like catch it. So I'm often doing that to kind of loosen it up and get it going.
What's the it? You mentioned before, is this the it you're talking about? Tuning into it. I suppose the question's got to be asked correctly because, well, we could probably say some things about it. And I'll let you reframe it as you like. But what is there to tap into? What is the space then to be created that when you know it, when you feel it, what does that space afford?
There's a heartiness to it. It's very much deeply related to having made the step into vulnerability repeatedly again and again, getting grounded in all those difficult experiences of my own or people that I've come into contact with. And in becoming more acquainted with that, it becomes less of a, I've got this body of feeling, and if I tap into it, it's going to come gushing out. And it's more that there's more of a continual flow of it. So you can kind of presence it and drop down. And in doing that, it seems to come outwards into the space around you.
Yeah.
It has like, a kind of very chesty, it seems to be emanating from here. And the effect of it is to be able to discern and notice things which are not quite apparent.
In others?
I have a sense that there's a real continuity between the noticing of the environment and the noticing in relation to others. So when I'm stepping outside my door, one of the things I've been experimenting with is just trying to notice the things that I didn't notice the time I walked down the street. Like everywhere I go, like looking for the bit that I haven't seen or noticed before. And feeling into the edges of things, the edginess.
Boundaries?
I actually wrote a little brief poem about it, which I'll try and recite for you.
Okay.
Lately, I've been noticing the edgedness of things. Straight-edged and round, an edgedness can be found. Of what it speaks is not quite clear, a seeing sharpened best by ear. So there's almost a bringing of the quality of hearing into the visual domain.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's think. It's as if so when we're speaking to others, let's say it's a group environment, there comes a time when the conversation or the interaction is presumed to draw to an end. It's like, we got to go now. We can't just be doing this forever. So it's like, how does it end? Are we going to talk again? Are we doing something together here? Are we just sort of saying hi at the supermarket and it's like, we'll see you around. If not, no problem. Are we actually doing something together? Are we actually doing something together? The thing is, we're all doing something together in the world. That is the big learning, that the things we do matter fundamentally. And then it becomes, if you want to follow that line, what should I be doing? What should we be doing? What's appropriate to do? And that's negotiation in part. And how we negotiate with others, and also how we see more fully, more clearly, how we can wend our perceptual matrix together so we can perceive more of the whole. This becomes crucial. And then what are we doing? Now we can see a little bit further. How should we be living together? And where's the boundary of me and you in all of that? Where's the necessary care for the individual in the collective? How do the individual and the collective relate? How to mediate these boundaries? How to sense what is and is not appropriate to ingress on in an environment? And are we even aware what the game we're playing is? All of these things, I think, are less certain than they've been perhaps for a very long time. At least so many arguments seem to go. And so I think that does lead us to an interest, at least many of us, to an interest in this process of how do I listen more to who I am, to who someone else is? Where is me in all of that? Where is something I can contribute to? What should I be doing? Skills to develop.
There's something very interesting about not knowing what is the game that's being played, so to speak. I think that going into these calls that I was describing to you, these kind of emergent communities that are cropping up, is seems to be stripping back a lot of the, well, there's kind of prescribed expectations that are hidden in the cultural milieu of what is it we're going to talk about in a park bench or a bus stop or whatever it is, a house party. In these spaces, there is a certain exploratoriness.
Mm-hmm. What patterns are you seeing emerge? Let's take, for example, just to give maybe a bit of context to that question. So, okay, see if I can. So, what's interesting? One thing that's interesting about entering a new space is what you're bringing with you to that space. Yeah, and this, of course, part of that is the subject matter of know thyself. But if you follow that down far enough, and all of a sudden know thyself becomes know a shared sense of isness that is fundamental to the self of perhaps all, but filtered through layer upon layer of patterns and interactions and over such long periods of time, as though that self has been fragmented, yet somehow remembers, is somehow as if magnetized to come into formation with the many fragments. And so another way to put this, what patterns come with us when we enter novel territory? You know, what patterns of perception do we bring with us? Like, what sort of archetypes are yet more than viable, necessary, so interwoven with the lineage of our organism and our perception that we cannot but see through them? And what then is the fertile ground for genuinely novel becoming, if we can make sense of such a novelty? It's a fundamentally interesting question right now.
Layers of the onion is very pertinent, and those layers just keep on going, and you keep peeling them back, and with each peeling back of a layer, perhaps slightly higher amount of spaciousness to see what it is that is appearing before you. So at the deepest level, those layers are traumas that we're not aware of. and the coming into awareness of them, usually through some sort of intense emotional release, and coming into terms with, you see a palpable shift in perception after an experience like that. And then you notice the pattern if you keep having those experiences. But at a more kind of bringing it up to a more surface level, as we enter into these spaces, there'll be little things that are triggered, thrown up in response to what you're hearing. And then there's a moment at which there's a question: am I listening to myself enough to notice that this thing has been thrown up? Does this space afford me the space to name it when it comes up? And do I have the courage? And do I feel encouraged by the people present to do so? So I dropped into a call the other week in a group that had kind of been practicing, like they'd done like 4 or 5 sessions. So they developed quite a lot of intimacy with one another, and there was a little bit of a culture to the group. So I came in having done a number of sessions, kind of in like a momentum of like leaning into community and leaning into and like finding like, oh, this is amazing. If I keep going in, I can keep tuning into this thing, and it consistently happens. But at that moment, what I was experiencing was some real resistance came up for me, relating to the culture already being present. And there was a language, like a very insignificant formal language about how the person like would say, I'm going to speak, and then I'm done speaking. They had a phrase for this. And just the presence of that, to me, brought up a resistance, probably to do with organized religion or something deep in the past for me. But perhaps not. But I named it, and it was received. And in the naming it, it was like I was able to, in being heard, I was able to let go of that and kind of entrust once more into the group, and subsequently drop into something with them.
That's good. Yeah, it's it strikes me that there's a key moment there, the kind of observation of something formal. Are we loose enough to be able to play with our formalities? This is the kind of thing can be a bit of a test, you know. Makes a lot of sense. So these groups, I'm not currently dropping into many groups. I have groups of people I talk to, and I have at various points sort of held group conversations in person and online, and plan to continue to do so. But I haven't really been drawn to, like, nothing's really popped up for me. Where are these sort of taking place? Are these through Rebel Wisdom? Are these kind of like, are they public facing groups? Are these groups of friends?
So yeah, this was one of them was the closed Rebel Wisdom group, the kind of Rebel Wisdom members group. And you see a lot of the new kind of podcasts end up producing their own kind of communities of their supporters, and there's something to be said for the fact that they are closed, perhaps, for what people may express in them. But a lot of the events have been at the Stoa of
Yes,
Peter
yeah, yeah.
Lindbergh, and that is a fountain of things going on, which are all public facing.
Yeah, time difference is a big deal for me here in Australia. Yeah, it's things are usually in the early hours of the morning. Yeah.
Well, one thing I will say is that capacity to notice that occurred in that group, then to name the thing that was coming up that was uncomfortable, that was an obstacle to the freer exploration, then carried across into one-to-one private conversations. Like, I found there was a continuity of that capacity, which allowed me then to reach places that I had not been able to reach before in an intimate relationship.
Yeah, there's something about the stepping forth, shoulders back, chest broad, in a kind of alignment. Here I am, I'm not leaving anything out that I could bring, that is presented to me to bring in this moment. This is the sense I can bring. All right, this is my being here. There's a be here together. There's a certain kind of confrontation to that, not necessarily aggressively, but certainly, all right, I'm coming here. I got my boundaries. Here it is, right? This is where we can meet. Are we able to meet here? And then that gives way to a kind of, if there is that capacity to orient, we can let go, and we can be with each other, and we can be with a new thing. So we surrender into a shared creation. Yeah. The challenge is, I find, what I'm experiencing a lot these days, it's not that I can't have meaningful conversations with people. It's that more and more I'm thinking, man, for the kind of conversations I really want to have, I think they might take about 10 hours, maybe more, and the kind of conversations I'm interested to have, as I was saying, I think before we started recording, there's a sense in which I'm not sure there is the setting for them. For me, the journey has always been one of feeling into the creation of a table to speak at. Yeah. So both speaking and creating the table, and realizing that can only happen if we all do so together. But it's this kind of weird period where, hey, we're not actually sure the dimensions of what this table is going to be. We're not actually sure what this structure looks like. At least there's not a certain kind of collective agreement. I'm not sure it's been felt. And who am I to say that kind of thing? It's partly that the kinds of conversations I feel most interested to have at this moment are the kind of conversations that are willing to open up to the fullness of relationship with world, as well as relationship within self and with other. And then we face this rather interesting thing of, fuck me, there are serious blocks of power out there in the world, and they are to be reckoned with. They are to be presenced somehow, right? They're in the subtext. They're permeating through the space, depending on the degree to which we are open to, well, making effective choices within an ever more present to mind context. And it's a rather fascinating thing, because what seems to be happening is people are talking to each other from all around the world in the kind of corner of the internet that I know you're referring to. And we've been forced to do it. We've been forced to speak to each other in many ways, disconnected from local communities, people not being able to leave their houses and what have you. And there's this sense of reaching out for community, reaching out for the kinds of settings where the setting itself helps realize the tempo and the rhythm for the kind of expression which leads to the crescendo of the kind of collective insight which places the collective, fits the collective and fits the individual within that collective more optimally to the reality that it's within. And I know for my part, it's like, man, I've met some beautiful people in my life and developed beautiful relationships and had wonderful relationships with people that hold the mantle of elder well. But to be honest with you, they've been few and far between. And much of my life was characterized by an absence of these people and a deep frustration with the lack of that kind of genuine authority, like a genuine teacherly authority. So it's been part of my character to consistently challenge, to consistently stand forth and be like, what the fuck is going on? What is going on here? Hey, what is going on here? And I'm still undergoing that process. And it's a gradual process. You have to kind of be smooth about it, you know, because people who take themselves to know what the fuck is going on, why do they necessarily want to talk to you? What does trust look like then? What does it mean to extend invitations to open into a kind of relationship of deepening intimacy about what matters? What does it take to extend that kind of invitation? How to communicate that transmedium? Because we might establish a kind of connection here, but we coordinated to be here through messages and through things that were, let's say, altogether far lower in resolution than the moment we might realize here together. So there's a kind of, going out on a limb or a certain kind of trust, in a certain setting aside of time. The coordination of people to be together for moments in time is a rather interesting thing. When it's not necessarily clear, you can propose to people what it is they should be gathered to do. Well, we might want to articulate some things about what we could discuss and what we could do together. But so much of the context that people are used to for gatherings is, what are we getting out of this? What am I getting out of with my time? It's like reasonable, right? We only have so much energy, but so much of that is, well, maybe if I take my experience with some of the business world, it's, well, what sort of, are we going to make some money out of this? Is this is a business project? Are we going to make some money out of bringing people together to have conversations? Are we meaningful conversations? Not much money in art if the art is not perceptible as art. So that's an interesting challenge, hey? And actually as well, we could tie in some other themes here, because I know you mentioned to me before we started talking about memetics. So what have you been thinking about there? Why do you think that's been coming up for you? And what feels most ripe in that inquiry for you at the moment?
So you use the words low resolution. I think we'll presence that definitely. And also fragmentation. Whether we like it or not, I think Twitter now is the primary medium, which is governing the course of human events, we may even say, more so than television. So all thought is being channeled into a medium which implicitly presents information in a linear fashion. So that's one component of it. We're forced to present linear information in a small amount of words, cold information rather than warm, rather than the warmth of my intonation being there. We have text. So that's one limitation. The potentiality for misinterpretation is implicit there. Then we can presence the memes themselves, which are also incredibly low resolution. If we think about like Je suis Charlie hashtag, or Black Lives Matter, or any number of these word-based memes, the meaning of them is completely up for interpretation.
Yeah, it's not at the same time, right?
Not at the same
Because
time.
if you interpret the way that isn't appreciated, it's like, whoa, hey, you're in a no, I was about to say you're in big trouble, but it's much worse than that. Yeah, the contortion of the world into way too tight, fixed, ultimately dead frames, the squeezing of complexity, the squeezing of duration, the destruction of duration itself into a fixed meme, a fixed presentation of a thing around which people then orient, often identity structures. Yes, this is a very problematic thing. Hey, how can we come into relationship with the dialogical transformation fundamentally, where we can presence memes in a flow and find ourselves between them, and altogether able to stand back from them and be full-blooded into them as well. How can we be more than the fixed dead? Jordan Peterson comes to mind. He always used to reference slogans. He used to hate, man hates slogans. And he used to say the etymology of that comes from something that meant a cry of the dead, something like that. He always used to make that point. I think it speaks to this kind of notion. Yeah.
So there's one framework which I saw from a guy, Jason Snyder. I don't know if you follow him on Twitter, but he's very kind of active in this area, very hot on memetics and stuff. He talked about.
I've had a few conversations with Jason.
Awesome. I haven't spoken to him yet, but I'm planning to soon. But his tweet recently was about the idea of the hyperobject, which is moving through our reality. And this hyperobject, as Zach Stein describes it, is an interrelation of complexities, which is so complex as to completely reject a meaningful understanding by way of linear capture through one particular matrix. And then what he says is what we have memetically, it's almost as if we have this hyperobject, which is multiple changing complexities occurring. And then we have this matrix, which is like this, you know? So the hyperobject is moving through, and then at different times, it's cutting across on a matrix. And then we get a polarity. And this seems to tie in some way, which is not yet clear to me, to a fascination with language and with the dialogos, and with the idea of logos. At the most basic level, in the sense that if we were to spend the next hour trying to make sense of the Black Lives Matter moment of right now, if we were to talk about one isolated incident, in order to properly understand it, we would have to weave a web of points, which would go through multiple domains. It would go through the social, it would go through the communications infrastructure, it would talk about the spiritual level, the level of nihilism, it would be talking about the distribution of power and wealth between boomers and all of the lower generations. And it would also be it wouldn't be temporally presenced as well. It would be going back. We would be talking about what was the effect of the war on drugs on the Black family structure in the United States in the 70s. And we'd be presencing that. So then we'd be bringing in the war on drugs, and we'd be bringing in the prisons and what's the relationship between the prisons and the war on drugs. So we would do something like this, and we would be weaving a complex web of things. And our capacity to do that would be enabled by the flexibility and the fluidity of language rather than text, than written text, and more so fragmented tweets. Setting aside all of the social incentives which bear on the authenticity of those expressions. There is this strong feeling I get of a certain coerciveness in the air. The coerciveness of the inviolable righteousness of progress. We could also presence this thing from Brett Weinstein and Eric Weinstein of the what do they call that? Just saw it today. It's basically the expression of these low resolution memes, such as defund police.
Yes.
Defund police, in which you have a radical proposition, and then you have a more palatable, reasonable proposition interspliced under one low resolution meme in a coercive context. And this also is very much interrelated with the characteristic I see, which is a really tenacious willingness to fight with people combined with a strange insincerity. I don't know if you've had the experience of trying to engage with someone who's playing that game from a point of sincerity, and you have this strange realization that it's like, this is not actually, that they're playing the game to win, but they're not sincere or serious about it in some way.
Yeah, I can relate to what you say. Yes, there's something about the way I seem to show up about the place, which often it's weird. It's like I actually don't find myself in those situations very much. And I used to go out quite a lot back a year and a half ago, before I met my girlfriend. We've almost been together a year now. But before then, for about a year and a year and a half or whatever, I used to go out 3-4 nights a week, often till quite late, to bars or clubs or what have you. And I very, very rarely drank, and if I did drink, I'd have like one drink, and usually because it was like socially, obligated to almost. I used to smoke some weed and I used to dance and get myself into, kind of bring out a little notepad and paper, and I'd do some, writing and dancing, and created quite the aura around me that didn't like, not much bollocks got too far into it. Do you know what I mean? Is it in that kind of state, you're just kind of standing there, then you just look at someone, and there's just not, it's like, yeah, there's something about energy that if you're kind of ready and willing to be who you are, then that, I think, cuts away at the vast majority of people who would play that kind of game. Now, then we find ourselves in contexts like, or maybe it's a panel discussion or something that you've been invited to, and all of a sudden you find yourself on a panel with some people there, and they're more or less committed to play a certain game, right? They're kind of standing as arbiters of a particular tribe or what have you. Or maybe you step into a conversation where the tone's already been established, a bit like the one you mentioned, where they kind of had a formal way of greeting. And let's say if you had been a part of that group, and that group had been in opening its space, basically running through a list of kind of sacred memes that it was more or less expected that everyone kind of just take, and sort of discussion could commence. You know, in an environment like that, you might feel, whoa, there's something that's come up for me here. It feels like, for me to be truly here and with you guys, for me to be actually tapped into something we could create together, I feel like I really have to speak to this, but maybe this person's not going to like that very much. And then how do you navigate that moment? And I suspect people find themselves in those situations actually all the time, especially when people start, I think, starting to develop a different perspective on social conversations, and recognizing how fucked they are, how absolutely fucked they are. You might think, wait a second, I love both of these people and they can't see each other. Like, I know that there's something wrong there. Like, on a soul level, these souls aren't connecting. What am I gonna do about this? And I think that can be very difficult for people. I'm not sure what to do about it, other than, well, actually, I have some, I think, probably quite developed theories on what to do about that, but it would take the conversation in a slightly different direction. And I wonder if we want to go there or not. I feel like there's a memetic desire piece to sort of bring in here that maybe you might wish to comment on, because you're sort of taking us through the thoughts that have been salient to you regarding this. It's particularly interesting. So it's about this notion of sincerity, and perhaps also real generativity, like genuine moments of novelty, really bearing up to potentiality, doing real thinking, let's say, in Jordan Hall's language. Well, how do we discern the difference? How can we open ourselves to do this kind of thing? How can we be sure we are not just copying based on a kind of unconscious desire simply to be accepted by, or fit in with, climb perhaps the ranks of a particular group? And this would be, the essence of kind of virtue signaling. But it's more complicated than that, though, because it's genuinely the case, it seems to me, that for the majority of people, in fact, and I could be wrong about this, but it does seem to me the case that when people are clamoring forth with their indignation, righteous indignation, it is righteous, that there is injustice and there is pain, and there's real desire to help and heal and point to wounds and go, stop fucking stepping on that wound, you motherfucker, and it's coming from a real place. It's just people are sort of waking up to that and not really having the capacity to formulate it within the kind of ideal communication community where you can move that understanding, where you can engage in dialogical transformation. And people are kind of reaching out, and they just want to get their perspective out there. They want to get their opinion out there. They just want to say their piece. And it's like, man, we've got a lot of people saying the same shit. What is it like to come together and listen for the emergence of something that we could all experience and be in, that is more beautiful? Interesting questions. Interesting questions.
As you were speaking, I found myself doing some like complex juggling acts of different possible pathways to go down, and then trying to bend all of those around and weave them into some sort of cogent response, whilst also recognizing that the best way for me to do that is to really not be thinking about it at all for the most part. So one thing that I've been thinking about is the notion of responsibility to the ecology, the information ecology,
Yes.
the memetic ecology. If we can accept that at some foundational level, these linear propositions are in themselves misleading insofar as they don't reveal the connection to the complex web of other factors involved, then we, and in the context of things heating the fuck up, as they are doing now, and as they have done before, we have this captivating emotional attractor, which has seen me spend about 3 days last week spending far too much time watching videos on Twitter.
Me too.
And then getting a little burnt out from just using the phone itself. But I've seen this trend in myself before because I used to pay a lot of attention to jihadist terror attacks in Europe. And I used to get plugged in to these 72-hour long information cycles in which I would feel that the best use of my agency was to imbibe every fucking thing that was coming in. And there was something which felt very important about that, as if it was coming, like working into my physiological instincts. So coming back to the responsibility, I face a number of decisions, but I think you can split it two ways. One is to attempt to create a memetic artifact within this limited matrix that we have, insert it in there, whether it's an article or a thread of tweets, and be so careful in the way that you do it that it actually has the effect of revealing those connections, and also brings warm data, and this is the pathway that I've found myself going down, is you refrain. You have there's a way in which this media hacks our cognitive grammar and has done. Anybody who uses Twitter knows this, that there is a way in which it hacks your proposition construction into tweet form. And so throughout the day, especially whilst on the platform, you have these propositional things pop up. Part of my exercising sovereignty or responsibility is filtering about 99.9% of those, because when they come up, I think about them, and I think about how will they be received, what will be the counter response, how will they affect the ecology, and usually there's a kind of cognitive loop which ends with, this cannot be expressed through the linear medium, it can only be expressed through conversation. And so I just refrain altogether, and I have this feeling that as much of the communication as possible needs to be moved to speech.
It's a good start. It's a good start, but it won't be enough, in my opinion. It won't be enough. An image that's been with me now for about probably about 3 weeks. I don't know how resonant it still is. It came to me in a moment of like expression that felt really resonant. There's this sense that imagine the drop. Hey, you're listening to a song at an electronic music festival, and you're into it, and then the beat is gathering energy, the crowd is gathering energy, and it goes up and silence. And now we're in that clearing right now. We're in that clearing right now. And then it comes back. That moment, the resetting, like, he could go, I mean, he could just walk away. The song continues, of course. We come back in, we crash back in. There we are together, a moment of resynchronization that everyone fucking loves, hey? It stops and it started again. We love it. That expectation and the tension of that. So, okay, what would it take for that kind of resynchronization? Yeah, a duration that we all were truly participating in. Yeah, it's not possible right now. I don't think it's possible right now. Not possible perhaps for a very long time. And to think on the scale of the world, you know, you're thinking of like a meteor hitting or something like this, but we can perhaps have some of these moments. But I'm thinking the kind of harmony, the kind of resetting of tempo and the participation in that even the most broken person in their very breath must be included in. That's the kind of metaphor. That's the kind of the vision. How can we all participate in a kind of resynchronization at such a fundamental level as to be, for all intents and purposes, almost imperceptible? That level of subtlety, yet nevertheless the kind of just so wise reorientation because of that. There's something about that which fascinates me, because we require, I think, for this moment to be involved, to be seen, to be heard, yeah, to be more symmetrically involved than we are now, and to be in continuity with the rhythm of life. This resynchronization. And we can do lots of that in conversation. You know, we can tune in with each other in that, and we can learn to listen, and we can really listen to people who are worthy of being listened to, you know, by lots of people. And I think that is the case. We can participate and collaborate and go off into break-off groups, and we can imagine how the questions deepened and insights gathered can be recorded and fed back, and we can think of a beautiful topological structure of fucking holarchic, up and down, left and right, multi-dimensional, all over the stack, all coming together real nice. And then it's like, well, what about drawing? What about music? You know, what about movement? What about that person who is in the throes of pain and cannot step outside, cannot decenter from that pain, but have that pain? How can that pain somehow be included, not from a place, and not from a place of judgment, of understanding, you know, to be appropriately open at the level that can enable some kind of grand participation in the resynchronization of sacredness, the reattunement to a kind of pulse that is comprehensible to the religious orientation, the religious impulse in every human being. It's like, I don't see how we get where we need to go without that eventually, because we're just too powerful, you know? And how we can go wrong so early, how we can take the wisdom traditions, how you can kill in the name of any god. Seemingly, people find that way, that whole integral thing, making the distinction between spiritual intelligence and spiritual experience, or the waking up and the growing up, you know, that we can have these crystalline, magnificent, energizing, ecstatic durations, which seem to be able to justify just about any possible action you could imagine. Death for any cause, you know. This is a peculiarity of human beings, and it's such a fundamental one. And it's a crazy thing. It's a crazy thing to take all of that seriously, and maybe we shouldn't. Maybe it's quite a crazy thing to say, but the collective art, hey, participation in collective art, where the kind of, to speak, with Jamie Will's framework, the kind of ecstasis, communitas, and catharsis, where the kind of ecstasis and catharsis, the grief and the appreciation and gratitude of those two things, and in the fullness of them, to be presenced in a harmony, appropriately open, in a community. Yeah, not committing itself to fixation that breaks and destroys that vital pulse before it, resonates up and down the body through the kind of sovereign acceptance, in this way of stepping forward, aligned, as you were saying before, entering that group, that everyone feels I am here, right? And this is happening for me as much as it is for you. I am involved in this. Hey, I matter here. Crazy thing. How many billions of people we got? How angry and how hurt and how isolated and how broken are so many? How fractionated are we? How fucked are our power games? Man, this is serious. These are serious times. And to play with all of that, that's what we're doing here. To seriously play with all of that. Yeah. I don't know how serious we're really being, to be totally honest with you. And I think not serious enough. I think not serious enough. But then again, there's so many people trying so hard and just expressing where they are, reaching out for connection. It's just to behold that kind of tension, that fear, and to be in a supple enough relationship with it to move with it and not solely be moved by it, or something like that. I mean, we need each other for that, and we need settings we do not presently have. And I'm very interested in the co-creation of those settings. That's for damn sure.
That care is so vital to this. At the moment you were describing all those people, I just felt this, like, all of a sudden something's coming out. How do we make that connection between our own pain and the pain of not a particular sectional group, but the human condition? As you were talking about power and pain, for whatever reasons, I was watching some of the protesters at Whitehall in London, running around with balaclavas on, and I was recollecting my own experiences of being in those kinds of contexts at the protests. And you see the small group of anarchists that's always present, and it's terribly exciting. There's a certain yearning for something to happen, which goes into that. How many of those people, how many of anyone in our culture has the opportunity to step into these spaces I've been describing, which they're not perfect, seem to create the condition for people to express their vulnerability and humanity in the absence of signing up to any doctrinal program. There seems to be an emergent understanding which requires little articulation. It's like the rules, the rhythm of the game is set by the presence of the people playing it. And there is a lot of pain being presenced. There's a lot of yearning, even in the context of these Zoom calls, for being around people, being able to embrace people in the same room. There's people who are just welling up and crying to people that they're connecting with through Zoom.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. It's a precious thing. There's some beautiful things happening at the moment. There's some beautiful energy. And I don't mean to, I certainly don't mean to belittle that in any way. I trust I wasn't coming across in that way. I'm speaking, I suppose, to the, I'm speaking to the integration of that kind of energy in the kind of critical juncture clearing that involves also those who are currently playing games of exploitation in various ways, you know, and plenty of other types of people too. It's there's a certain reckoning when we've had, you know, revolutions in the past, and I'm not a particularly well-read person in history, hey, but we think of violent revolutions, the reckonings were often at the end of guillotine, you know. This kind of reckoning is not appropriate now. It's not realistic. It's not ethical. It would repeat the very same dynamic which it was claiming to revolt against. So why am I presencing this? Is to open up then to what is it, to how open is appropriately open. It's that kind of perspective, hey? Because say appropriate openings, there are also appropriate closures. And to get the ethics of that right, not from a place of judgment, to get the ethics of that right, where you can straight up say no, hey? You shall not pass, motherfucker. Get down there. We fight you on that fucking tower top. No. Yeah, powerful no. The appropriateness of that kind of aggression, which is to be realized appropriately in combat. But to have that be truly the last resort without it being weak, you know, that is a fine balance which fascinates me. It's and the setting which can realize that. So I just think we need, it's so I'm not sure we can really be who we are at the moment because the settings are not conducive to it. There's something emerging, you know. We talk about archetypes. I attended the Breaking Convention in 2015, and there was a speaker there. I've forgotten his name, and he gave a presentation. What does it mean to create an archetype, or can we create archetypes? And, he was of the opinion that we could and that we needed to, and I couldn't understand what he was talking about at the time. I've since rewatched it, and to be honest with you, I don't think he had that much sense to say. I don't think he particularly communicated the nature of archetypes particularly well, at least not to my perception. But the question always stuck with me. Hey, what does it mean to create an archetype? And Jordan Peterson always used to begin his many lectures like this. He'd do some shtick about Nietzsche and the death of God, and then he'd talk about Jung being a student of Nietzsche's, and Nietzsche's response to the death of God being the overman and the Ubermensch who could create his own values in line with that master morality, the simple affirmation of life as a kind of will to power. And then he'd be like, well, Jung was like, hey, wait a second, it's not so easy to just create your own values. And it's like, okay, it doesn't seem to me Jordan ever really got out of that dynamic. He's kind of stuck somehow, frustrated in the middle of that. But what does it mean to create an archetype? Because on the Jungian way of thinking, or at least to my conception, it's like we particularize archetypes. And we individuate and instantiate ourselves as unique persons, become who we are in a way that is irreducibly us. It is unique, is individuated, but is the realization of patterns in potential. We particularize the archetypes, and this is appropriate. We do not realize the archetypes as such, we particularize them to ourselves. But what is it? But that's not necessarily, you might think, the same as creating one, hey? Because they're kind of these latent potentials. They're in the kind of possibility space, patterns of evolutionary adaptive behavior, methods of niche construction, group dynamics, masculinity, femininity, Joker's archetype, shadow, all the rest of it. What does it mean to create an archetype? What kind of novelty is really possible? I've been trying to think about this for a long time. And I think the notion of phase transition plays into this quite interestingly. People are always talking about how that caterpillar go to that butterfly. Hey, it's still a caterpillar, right? What about the caterpillar goes with it to become the butterfly? It's like, well, thinking about that is an interesting thing. Also, thinking about the theory of the adjacent possibles is an interesting thing, right? And the exponential increase of that, or at least it looks like an exponential, but then I've heard that described as eventually that exponential becomes a straight line all the way up. It's like, what becomes of that then? It's just, how do we make sense of that which is so radically beyond what is able to be made sense of by our coherence making structures, that there is simply an is which is beyond. It's like, how to even get a grip on that? And I think we can think about it. I'm not saying what we can do. I'm not saying this is how to think about it. This is all just this is all obviously very esoteric, but there's a sense in which we can take a shift perspective on that and consider the medium of communication, the medium of the realization of these patterns, as being the modality, as being the medium wherein this emergence takes place. So that's kind of what I mean by, I'm not sure we can be who we are without the context within which to be that. It's building the table as well as being at the table at the same time. It's that hand, like that Eric Weinstein references that hand which draws itself, or something like this. It seems to be the case, man. We've been gathering for a long time, human beings walking around and circling stuff. We feel in together and waiting for that right moment where pop.
All right. remarkable to me is that you've just kind of tended toward the other area that I've been contemplating quite continuously for the last 2 weeks without my even presencing it. And I was also reading Lord of the Rings, so right on. Power. The quality of revolutions very often is a recapitulation of the existing understanding of power. What we have is game A social justice working against a game A system. Now there's a Black feminist who is thinking very differently to most Black feminists, I imagine, who I've come across a couple of weeks ago through Emerge. Her name I can't remember, but she's come up with this excellent notion of exousiance. And what she's doing is reconceiving of power itself through analogy to the patterns that she sees in nature and through a more intuitive, the book is called Sensuous Knowledge, a more intuitive sense. She talks about the patterning of rivers and the way that you have these recurrent branching patterns and currents, and the way in which nature has a capacity to work around and to have convergence of different streams and to produce resistance at times, but then to be very subtle to the point of not being visible. So we can presence this power. And I'm also feeling from you that there's a kind of transition from a role perhaps you've played of the willingness to be seen as an asshole by people by taking the critical stance to something which is actually more akin to soul force. And this is what is completely absent presently. I've been listening to Dr. King, Reverend King, recently as well, who is a perfect embodiment of this logos, soul force presence. And I've also been having these experiences wherein the more deeply I'm coming into and grounding in this soulness and the vulnerability of it, or when you initially do that, it can be very tumultuous and there's a working out of boundaries and you've opened yourself up, and now there's a possibility of exploitation. But as you experience that a number of times and come to a deeper understanding of it, then it actually becomes quite a palpable boundary, and we can be both open and stridently assertive, and you can assert something from soul. And the last component which you presence, I believe, was mystery. This is, to my mind, quite fundamental, not only to my own inquiry, but to all inquiries and all discourse. To the extent that we are not presencing mystery, we've created a closed container. And that produces a lack of fluidity, change. And so the quality of how this exousiance, how this power works, how someone with soul force actually has impact upon the world is very often not visible, very often quite mysterious. And it's not playing this game of I am disempowered and therefore I must take power from somebody else. who has it. The existing structures have it. I don't have it. I'm disempowered. When we're coming into soul force, we can come into recognition of those injustices in the material world, without being disempowered, because you're playing game B to the extent that you have presenced your own death. You've come into relationship with your own death. You've seen the mountaintop. So here's one area that's a little bit, so you're talking about the willingness to die for cause. I would put it to you that a proper embodiment of soul force would in some way have a willingness to die, coming from a place of already having accepted death. So I'd be interested, as well as just bouncing off, how do we kind of pass that one out?
What are the two sides what's the thing you're looking to pull apart there, or what's something you're looking to carefully?
That's actually very helpful that you asked me again. So perhaps there's an ecstatic willingness to give over to the cause in such a way that it gives one meaning. And then there's a property of meaning which is completely independent of the outcome of the cause. And therein lies the distinction between Martin Luther King and Anwar al-Awlaki or someone like that. But that's not quite an arrival point either, because there's issues at play with the notion of paradise and the attachment to that thing which is outside of the immanent world. Is my willingness to die premised on my expectation of reward in the next life? Or is it coming from a place of having utterly let go of my beingness altogether, such that I am both fully invested with all of my being in the game and in some way outside of it? And I wonder what's the relationship to mystery there as well.
Oh, well, look, there's the sense in this, and I'm rarely one to make this move actually, but there's a sense in this that the resolution to what you say is of course not to be found in a conversation. Of course not to be found in the articulate passing out of these things, although we can be articulate in much of what we can say about it, because I ain't particularly willing to die this evening. Do you know what I mean? Like, the context. Yeah, I've not meditated on the way I'm going to die as I open this balcony back up into my apartment and I get some ice cream out of my freezer. You know, I've missed that meditation. I'm pretty much banking everything on that not happening. And so it's like, Oh, and I also part of me have had resistance for some time to speaking about psychedelics in this context, but I'm far enough into the conversation now where I think I will. There's a sense that the moments of swirling energy that it seems to me the appropriate orientation point towards is surrender, at least that type of energy to which the appropriate orientation is surrender, is it's like you know it when it comes. You know it when it comes. And so the mystery element is the not knowing when the moment is until it comes, perhaps. And in that moment, there is the collapse of this being absolutely for the cause, but also being accepting that the cause itself is not I was going to say all there is, but there's a sense in which actually the imminence of ingression into death there is precisely what is, but that infinite move through you in that duration is at the same time a kind of release into emptiness. So it's that hold, it's the tension reconciled of loving construction and release. And to speak to that at all is something clearly separate from the being of that in its immanence. And so it's here then we have the analysis and the mysticism, and we are doing them both, being hopefully humble before them both, in relationship with them both. Beautiful question, though. Beautiful question that you presenced and brought in there.
I feel like kind of spiraling up into paradox and reaching a point where you're like dancing between the two of them. And at some point it's like, oh, actually, it's less about the iteration of the paradox itself. And this may sound like a cop-out of a very difficult spiral of paradoxes, but it's the orientation. And for whatever reason, the topic of the dance or the rhythm was coming back up for me when you were saying that. And within the context of those psychedelic experiences, the rhythm, the relationship to the rhythm becomes the most imminent and important thing. Propositional thinking goes out the window. Very often you have the experience of spiraling out of paradoxical thinking continuously. I certainly had this, like, oh, I have a thought and then I have a counter negation, and I continued doing this, and it was utterly frustrating. And at some point I let go of the whole endeavor, and it became much more musical in quality. And there's a real absence of art in this outpouring. There's such a cold constraint in the culture of the movement and in the medium through which it's being articulated. But when I listen back, which I have been doing, to the songs of the late 60s, you see just such a wide variety of expressions which were able to engage with what was going on without being subjugated to the political. It was still about the music on some level. And there was also a diversity of focuses.
Mm.
You had the Summer of Love going on bang in the middle of perhaps, the most heated, sort of 67, 68 was the most heated. You had the best music being made and the best concerts being made. You had people singing songs about come together, love one another. But you also had people singing songs about the eve of destruction and, Nixon's coming with his guns and stuff.
Well, this decade's just beginning. 2020 has only just been, it's had a few surprises for us already. Yeah, this decade's going to be a feisty one. It's going to be, man. I always say to myself, at various points in my life, I have no idea where I was going to be next year, like this time next year, where I'm going to be. That'd be bloody interesting again this time next year. What's going to be going on? There'll be music. It'll come, I think.
Yeah, this time in 3 or 4 months for me, I have no idea. I'm hoping for a very beautiful, difficult decade.
Yeah, well, I think you might be onto something there, certainly with the difficulty. Man. So where to take it from here, hey? The where I take it from here, at least, is a sincere appreciation of gratitude for this conversation and being here with you. And I know that there will be more conversations to come, and I'm organizing a bunch. I have been for a while, and by the time this is released, if it's released, it'll probably be fairly straightforward to follow the breadcrumbs to find out where they're happening and to join me, at least, in experimenting with how we take this on and see what kind of collective art we can create. That's the ticket. It's towards the co-creation of art.
That's what Terence always said, and feels so affirmed right now. What goes on creating art? What goes on making my life actually meaningful and enjoyable is so equally of value. Getting out in nature, just being, is fucking fundamental to this and inseparable from it.
Yeah.
And hopefully what we can do together is create the context in which that is understood by more and more of the right kind of people.
People who
Not
are
everyone.
ready.
People who are called to it, but there will be more who want to take this moment seriously, want to understand what's their role to play. Also know that their happiness and the meaning in their life cannot be derived from their activism. Their consumption of information cannot be the basis of the singing of the highest song of their spirit.
Yeah, there's a lyric that comes to mind. Singing the song that's inside us all. Yeah. What would it be like to sing together, hey? I think a lot of my life is just the chasing. It's like chasing the image that was present in me and that I lived through when I was a young boy singing. I used to love to sing, and it was my greatest joy. And I stopped singing when I was, well, I didn't stop. I started again, and but never really stayed with it, and always retained some degree of trauma around it. There's something about singing together which is a deep longing, I feel, and I hope we can. Yeah, it would be nice to sing together with people again. Don't look for any more profundity than that.
Right on, brother.
I'm all done.
No kumbaya.
Yeah. It'd be nice to sing together. It would be nice. The turn for me is also more local again, happily. I've been building a context and a place to be online, but in Australia at least, we seem particularly privileged. Things are now opening up quite a bit again. And I am going to be restarting the local groups I was holding, gatherings I was holding last year. And so, yeah, I've got good feelings about that. I would love to be able to connect groups that form here with groups online, and to kind of trade inquiries back and forth. This would be a really beautiful thing. It'll probably take about 4 to 6 months to get to that point, I reckon. But yeah, in the meantime, the online stuff will continue. I have nothing more to say.
It's been a pleasure, Tim.
Yeah.
You sung the song. At some point, the song must end. So we'll wrap up the recording here, but this has been awesome.
Yeah, man. Thank you. Hey, it's been beautiful. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to talking again. Yeah.